Trevor, maybe you want to tell us a little bit more about what some of these specific FDA SBOM requirements are.
Sure. So there are a couple of big things that we have to look at. The first, of course, is the SBOM. And you touched up on the NTIA requirements that the FDA then expanded a little bit upon, making sure that we're getting an accurate level of information as far as the components of the SBOM, the source of these components, everything going all the way down the line. Second big area that we look at is the end of support. So it's pretty common, especially in the open source world, to have a package that acts as a passion project or loses steam and then development ends, or continuous maintenance ends. When that's the case, it is not uncommon for a vulnerability to pop up and then never get remediated. So knowing when that end of life happens and knowing what the plan of action is to get around that is really important. And seeing these vulnerabilities pop up in unsupported products might mean that there's time to make a shift or find an alternative solution. The final really important thing to touch up on here for the SBOM is tracking the vulnerabilities. So even with components that are currently supported, vulnerabilities can pop up all the time. And they can come up in, vulnerabilities can be discovered that have been present for a very long time in a component, but they're only recently discovered by a security researcher. So that's where the continuous monitoring part of an SBOM comes in. You have to make sure that it's constantly tracked for these vulnerabilities as security researchers are discovering these findings, and it's not just a one and done process. So for having a complete SBOM, the key word there is complete. The SBOM can't miss any components, and that's oftentimes a struggle for a lot of organizations to get that full SBOM and know exactly what's in it. One issue that we commonly see is defining that scope and not going too far outside of it. So oftentimes certain other tools or like an internal tool or a build script will get pushed into a overall source code repository. And then when that happens, that can often be added to an SBOM when it is not actually part of a final product. Having said that, you need to make sure that anything in that final product is accounted for, along with everything that we had looked at as far as the end of life and vulnerability assessment. Once that's been covered and the SBOM is complete, you've tracked the vulnerabilities, make sure that you're remediating as much as you can, it goes on to sort of that ongoing phase. Continuous monitoring for the vulnerabilities, making sure you're not picking up anything that shouldn't be in there, and then having a good plan in place to share and distribute the SBOM. So the FDA mandates that current users of a product or a device have access on demand to a latest version of the SBOM. And that latest version is a very important part. You can't have an out-of-date one from the initial build, and that's why sort of that continuous building and continuous tracking of the SBOM is very important.
Thanks, Trevor. Quick thing before we move forward, had a question come in. Will the presentation deck and recording be shared with attendees? The answer is yes. You'll receive an email from us afterwards with a link to the slides as well as a link to the recording. So with that, Trevor, really appreciate that sort of overview. And you mentioned this concept of a complete component inventory. And Cortez, wondering if you could sort of speak to some of the considerations around ensuring that inventory is in fact complete.
Absolutely. And, Trevor, I think you hit on what I think is a really, really interesting challenge, which is how do you ensure that your SBOM is representative of the final artifact, right? Oftentimes there's, build, test, and compile dependencies that are used in assistance of creating that final artifact, but are not actually in use. There's also maybe even smaller questions, which is just because a particular dependency or package is a part of a final artifact, is it actually being used by the software or the code within that particular component? And so we oftentimes are looking to represent only the list of components that are actually in use, that are deployed in the final artifact, and most importantly, providing unique identifiers to be able to associate those. I am a huge champion of package URL, in particular for open source components, because that allows for you to uniquely identify the components, which will then allow for whether internally in your own companies with external companies in the form of Blue Goat, or even with the FDA themselves can then ingest that to be able to look up your specific component to then associate vulnerabilities or end-of-life information. Of course, CPEs are really powerful as well in cases with such as commercial software where you're unable to provide a package URL. And the last one that I think is absolutely huge is this conversation around how do you represent a full dependency graph. Oftentimes vulnerabilities will be in second, third, fourth, and fifth level transitive dependencies, and the only way to then be able to have a true assessment of how that vulnerability is becoming in is to be able to have the full dependency graph representation there. And the last thing I will say to this is oftentimes there's a misunderstanding that only direct dependencies are important as it pertains to creating your SBOM. Now, I am strongly of the belief that transitive dependencies are extremely important to include in consideration to have that complete picture. Trevor, I would love to hear from your perspective on how you think about the whole direct versus transitive dependency as a complete SBOM assessment.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. It's really important to have that as a consideration. I think one thing that's really important, and you touched up on that, is seeing what is actually used in the final product. So oftentimes you'll see that there are multiple transitive dependencies that a certain aspect of are utilized in the project, but that might not necessarily be a vulnerable part of it. So tracking down what the vulnerability is, where that lies in the code, and how that's flowing into the product is very important. And it can often take a little bit of time to find that right balance, but that's so that you're making sure you're not doing too much work as far as having to essentially rebuild the library if there's a vulnerability that may not apply, and also avoiding the possibility of introducing unnecessary risk to the patient.
Absolutely. And I think that's also an interesting segue into what I continue to think about is static versus dynamic attributes of an SBOM, right? And so your supplier, your component name, the version, unique identifier, all very, very static attributes of an SBOM. But what about things like end of life or end of support information, which is going to change over the life of that particular SBOM? We'd love to hear more of your thoughts there, Trevor.
Definitely. So this is an area that can be a little bit difficult to track. Oftentimes developers for an open source project aren't releasing continuous information, and they aren't saying this is when we plan to have an end of life notification. They may just entirely drop off of the project. There are a couple of ways to get around this. The first is just having some continuous monitoring on a specific project, seeing, well, it hasn't been updated in 3 to 6 months. We're seeing a little bit of a gap there, and that could indicate that the project has essentially been abandoned. If that's the case, there should be an appropriate plan to make sure that any vulnerabilities that pop up are remediated, and a little bit of a risk analysis to see what the true impact of leaving that in the system would be.
I think what is then also really interesting is going back to that static versus dynamic structure. Obviously on the vulnerability side, as you mentioned earlier, Trevor, vulnerabilities are going to continue to come out on a regular basis, regardless of any updates that have been made to that particular code. And so there's both this interesting initial assessment that you have to do around your vulnerability posture when doing a pre-market or 510K submission, but then there's also then that continuous element of this. And I think it is super interesting to me because the question then becomes, how do you deliver these continuous updates to either the FDA or hospitals or whoever is consuming that particular end product, and be able to inform them of your exploitability status. Oftentimes we speak heavily here on the FOSSA side around just because a vulnerability exists on a particular open source dependency does not mean that you're using that as you were mentioning in a vulnerable way, whether that be a particular component is not delivered, a particular function is not being used in a vulnerable way, you're not submitting the particular payload that is required for that to be compromised. And so having ways to be able to communicate that exploitability, whether that be via things like the vulnerability disclosure report or the vulnerability exploitability exchange, become incredibly powerful. There's even things like obviously CSAF and other customer security advisories. And so I'm really curious as to how you are thinking about that in your end, Trevor, the actual communication piece of these exploitability of vulnerabilities.
So that's a really interesting point to bring up, is what should be communicated as far as an SBOM. I know that we briefly had touched up on how important it is to have that distribution, have that sharing, and then there's a matter of what all is included in that SBOM, what the actual impact of that is. Sure, we'll get into a little bit of the misconceptions here coming up, but oftentimes we'll hear a complaint of, well, if I share an SBOM, isn't that going to introduce just essentially a roadmap into attacking our system? And the answer that I usually try to give for that question is, well, no, that's not the case. We generate this SBOM, we have the vulnerability assessment, so we know what those problems are, and then we fix them before we're putting that out in the open. And there's not going to be an attack path as long as we have our proper cyber hygiene in place. Now, as far as getting the SBOM out into the open, sharing it for distribution, it's really important, and there's an industry-wide push, especially backed by the FDA, for cybersecurity transparency in all areas. And SBOM distribution is a very key part of this. Users of a medical device especially are entitled to know what they are using, what goes into it, in the same way you wouldn't want to drive a car if you don't know what parts are in the car. So having that information available about the makeup of a product is really important. As far as the actual method for distribution, we see a couple of different options. The first is manual requests. This is often a little bit more involved on the manufacturer's side to get that SBOM over. And what that process is, typically the user will fill out a form saying, hey, I'd like to request access to the SBOM. The manufacturer gets that form, reviews it, and then turns it over as quickly as possible, taking that latest version and passing it on to the customer. Having a portal is another great solution. There can be a private or a public portal, and that way it sort of takes out some of the guesswork. It can be included as part of the cybersecurity labeling for a device that you can access the SBOM at a certain location. It's always kept up to date and is out there for anyone to get. This is a great way to push towards that increased cybersecurity transparency, and it eases up on the workload of the manufacturer while making sure that users always have the latest version whenever they may need it. All of this sort of ties into that post-market phase, and once a device has been fielded, the continuous evaluation of a device. And so I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on what else might go into that area.
Yeah, I think that's like a really interesting perspective, right? Which is, if I want to be able to monitor this on a continuous basis, I need a couple of parts. One, I need a continuously updated vulnerability and end-of-life database. And those are often, the end of life in particular is often not sources that are easy to obtain. And so we'll talk about this, I think, in a bit more detail of like where you can think about associated end of life in particular for open source packages. But I think on the vulnerability side, it's a little bit much more straightforward. And so obviously you have some of your base sources from the NVD. You want to expand upon those depending on what types of components you're using, in particular for using, things like embedded systems and wanting to have specific, Linux kernel configurations in mind when associating your actual impact vulnerabilities. And so one is, does this vulnerability even exist on a particular package and dependency that I'm using? Step two then is obviously, am I exploited by this? And then step three is, how do I then communicate that back with my sharing or distribution method of choice? And so I think there is a lot of considerations that kind of go in place as you're addressing that kind of continuous monitoring piece of that.